Christian and postmodernist allied to betray Nietzsche. Jacques Derrida was a 70s post-structuralist or so-called postmodernist philosopher who used a technique called deconstruction to examine language in Enlightenment institutions. John D. Caputo is a current postmodern Christian who used post-structuralist deconstruction to study the concept of God. Dumbass pseudo-intellectual crackpots, like famous former clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, has repeatedly accused Derrida and other post-structuralists of being atheist Marxists. Strange that Derrida used evil deconstruction in favor of God. In The Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida, Caputo gets into why he and other philosophers who admittedly have the same Christian interpretation of deconstruction as Caputo agree that Nietzsche's own definition of his concept called differance was incorrect. Most people have probably heard of Nietzsche, right? He's a famous German existentialist philosopher who went mad in the 1800s and came up with the famous misquote, God is dead, or in the original German, Gott ist tot. The actual quote is something more like, the old gods are dead and we have killed them. Thus, it's from Nietzsche's fable, Thus Spake Zarathustra. That's obviously the name of the classical music song. This is the main theme for Stanley Kubrick's awesome classic sci-fi film 2001: A Space Odyssey, based on one of the best original classic science fiction novels, Arthur C. Clarke's science fiction book. That reminds me, Isaac Asimov is awesome too. But anyway, so the famous line is actually slightly different in each of Nietzsche's two books where he mentions it, but some version of the old gods are dead and we have killed them is also in Nietzsche's book called The Gay Science. The uh, not homosexual dudes banging science. Gay is in the old-fashioned definition of the word meaning happy. Anyway, contrary to the misquote, Nietzsche, of course, was not claiming that religion is dead. This is in spite of the fact that he was just as much of an atheist as unhinged and biased militant atheist Sam Harris is. Nietzsche literally wrote a book called The Antichrist, with Nietzsche's the old gods are dead, blah, 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 and so on. He basically just means that over the past few hundred years at this time, the Enlightenment had been secularizing culture, making people less fundamentalist and more secular in their Christianity. Nietzsche had a concept called differance. That is a French pronunciation and is not spelled in the same way as difference. It also has a different meaning. Yes, difference is spelled differently from and has a different definition than difference. Everyone knows what difference means. To oversimplify, difference is essentially defined as more different than different. In one of my previous videos on this book, I explained Caputo outlining how Derrida reinterpreted postmodern deconstruction to pretty much reverse it. This somewhat deliberate misinterpretation allowed Derrida to save the name and idea of God from deconstruction. Remember that fellow post-structuralist and famous pervert, Michel Foucault, used deconstruction against religion rather than support it, as Derrida did. Foucault deconstructed God in his work, meaning that he broke it down in writing and rhetorically in order to criticize it. He used deconstruction to defeat God. Derrida hijacked Nietzschean difference to use it for the opposite purpose of Derrida and Nietzsche. He was God's bro. Caputo agrees with Derrida that Nietzsche's interpretation of difference is perverse. That's literally how Caputo puts it. Nietzsche saw it as an overseeing secular force even more powerful than God. To him, difference is above God in Jordan Peterson's noble hierarchy. This makes it the king of a sophisticated authoritarian idol, asserting its primacy over God. That's what Caputo claims Nietzsche's view on difference is, anyway. Remember that philosophers often deliberately misinterpret another philosopher's concepts to hijack their meaning for ulterior philosophical motives. In my recent video on critical theorist Habermas's book, The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, he mentions the famous continental philosopher Hegel's so-called system of absolute knowledge. Hegel uh, is somewhat misinterpreted as the inventor of German idealism. Um, Oh, wait, no, sorry. He somewhat misinterpreted the argument of the inventor of German idealism, Fichte's own system of absolute knowledge, because Hegel preferred it to be based on the philosophy of subjectivity. He adopted Fichte's system based on the subject rather than subjectivity in order to destroy it from within. Caputo supports Derrida's reinterpretation of difference. He argues that Nietzsche's definition is nothing but the glass screen through which faith sees darkly. That is so fucking well worded. I love it. Nietzsche's difference is the glass screen through which faith sees darkly. Caputo used deconstruction to totally reverse difference. Remember that while Foucault used post-structuralist deconstruction to get rid of God, Derrida used it to save God from deconstruction by making it, as I call it, indeconstructible. Derrida essentially sees God as incapable of being deconstructed. Caputo says that deconstruction is not over God, but below it. The name of God is always before deconstruction of itself and more than it. God is its own separate, indeconstructible category. To Caputo, deconstruction comes limping along lamely as a postscript to God. I like this argument, but it actually seems to fail to me. Deconstruction is always a neutral tool that can be used for any purpose. But Nietzsche's difference was sure as fuck not intended to be that way. Derrida using deconstruction to place God as indeconstructible kind of works, but reinterpreting difference doesn't do that. I think that Caputo is just using Derrida's tactic, but failing because while Nietzsche has some similarities with post-structuralists, he was not one. He preceded them, and they have a lot of differences. For example, while Derrida is reversing the meaning of difference, Foucault is a Nietzschean who often uses Nietzsche's concepts to support his post-structuralist views that have little to do with God. Deconstruction is a neutral tool. Nietzsche is rolling in his damn grave in reaction to Caputo trying to use his concept created by a militant atheist to supposedly prove God. Caputo is just switching the definitions of difference and deconstruction. He misinterprets difference to apparently make the name of God indeconstructible by implying that God literally is difference, basically. Nietzsche would obviously have a colossal problem with a Christian hijacking his concept and saying that God is difference. This is just stabbing Nietzsche in the fucking back, man. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but that's what's happening. So Derrida used deconstruction to support God. He wasn't a fucking Marxist atheist, as Jordan Peterson claims. He went against Foucault, who used deconstruction to kind of do away with God. Caputo agrees with Derrida that Nietzsche's concept of difference is useful, but its meaning needs to be reinterpreted. Nietzsche was a militant atheist who said that we killed God. He definitely did not create difference as an argument in favor of God. You can define difference as more different than different. So different is so different that it's in its own category and can always be clearly distinguished from everything else. Nietzsche viewed difference as a secular force that is separate from and more powerful than God. Caputo agrees with Derrida that this is perverse. Derrida reinterprets difference as a door for faith. He used deconstruction to completely reverse Nietzsche's original meaning. So, Derrida used deconstruction and Caputo used Nietzsche's differance to place God as indeconstructible. To Caputo, difference justifies why God is above deconstruction. But Nietzsche is obviously rolling in his fucking grave at the thought of Derrida and Caputo betraying his idea of difference to use it for his religious or perhaps Christian purposes, more specifically. There's nothing wrong with being religious, but Nietzsche would feel like they fucking stabbed him in the back, man. Christian Caputo and postmodernist Derrida ally to betray Nietzsche.